I am super bullish on ground beef. I believe ground beef will continue to outperform real estate. And I want to explain why me being super bullish on ground beef means that it might be a good idea for you to own Bitcoin. If we look at ground beef's price over time, we can see in the 1980s through the early 2000s, it was pretty stagnant. And then it really started to take a sharp increase in price right around 2010. Between 2010, when it was at $2, and today, when it's at over $6 per pound, ground beef has more than tripled in 15 years. If we compare this to the M2 money supply, which is basically the amount of money that is circulating in an economy, we can see that the M2 money supply seems very similar to the price of ground beef. If we look right around 2010 to today, M2 money supply has almost tripled, just as ground beef has over tripled from 2010 to 2025. Funny how that works. Taking a look at real estate's price over time, we can see that ground beef has actually outperformed real estate. Looking at that 2010 marker that we looked at with ground beef, we can see for real estate, the median house price was roughly $200,000. And today, that median house price is a little over $400,000. So real estate has only roughly doubled over the past 15 years, whereas the price of ground beef has more than tripled. So ground beef is outperforming real estate, and I believe that we will continue to see this trend of ground beef outperforming real estate. Now that we understand the previous price appreciation of both ground beef and real estate, let's take a look at the changes in supply of the ground beef and real estate. So looking at the US cattle inventory over time, we can see that from 1867 through roughly 1975, the cattle inventory went pretty much nothing but up. There were cycles of the inventory going up and down that usually lasted roughly 8 to 12 years. But for the most part, it was going straight up until roughly 1975. Interesting, by the way, how we went off the gold standard in 1971, and soon afterwards, this cattle inventory started declining. I know you might not see how that's correlated, but I will get into it a little bit later on. And then after 1975, the cattle inventory has been pretty much nothing but down. So the ground beef supply or the cattle supply has been going down. Ground beef supply has been going down. There are also ways to make cows a little bit larger now. So the ground beef supply hasn't gone down quite as much as the cattle supply. The supply of real estate is pretty self-explanatory. It is steadily going up. We are building houses and not destroying houses. So real estate is just going to steadily go up over time for its supply. So looking at the reasoning of the cattle supply going down and housing supply going up, so the housing supply can more easily be manipulated to increase the supply because you can do things like make housing smaller and you can build upwards. So you can always increase the supply of housing. However, cattle, on the other hand, the supply is difficult to manipulate to be able to increase the supply of cattle. For example, you cannot build agricultural land up. You can only build it out. So there are much heavier limitations to the amount of land you can use for agriculture compared to the amount of land you can use for real estate because you can build up with real estate, giving you virtually unlimited amounts of land to build real estate on top of if you can constantly build up. So agricultural land is more scarce than real estate. So I believe that the supply of cattle, the supply of ground beef will always be more scarce than the supply of real estate and the supply of housing. On top of that, there are some other reasons why the supply of cattle has been going down, and I'll get into that in the next slide. Now, you might tell me, but Aiden, people need housing. They don't need ground beef specifically. So if ground beef becomes super expensive, the demand's just going to go down, helping to stabilize out that price. Now, that may be true, but people might not necessarily need ground beef specifically, but they do need food. And even if the demand for more expensive foods, such as ground beef, goes down, that's going to drive the demand for less expensive food up. So then production's going to shift away from the more expensive foods like ground beef towards less expensive foods. So farmers, rather than utilizing lots of their land to produce the more expensive foods like ground beef, they'll be utilizing more land to produce less expensive food. So that's going to lower the supply of cattle because they are shifting their agricultural land away from being used for cattle and being shifting it towards being used to farm less expensive foods that people could afford and that higher demand is there for, which would continuously drive the price of ground beef up because the supply would continuously be going down as the production shifts towards less expensive foods. So going back to this chart on cattle inventory in the United States, I believe that this sharp decrease in cattle inventory from 1975 to the present can largely be explained by inflation. Yes, we have had some less favorable agricultural conditions, but I believe that inflation is a big correlation for this downtrend in cattle inventory and will be the reason why we continuously see a smaller and smaller cattle inventory in the United States. Because remember, in 1971, we went off the gold standard. We saw a lot of inflation. And with that inflation, people are able to afford ground beef less and less because it gets more and more expensive. And as it's getting more and more expensive, the demand for it is shifting away from the ground beef and towards less expensive foods. So farmers are utilizing their agricultural land less and less for cows and cattle and more for these to produce cheaper foods because that's where the demand is shifting for. So when the demand shifts away from the ground beef because of the rising prices, that's going to drive down the supply of ground beef, which is going to even increase prices even more. Now, here's where Bitcoin comes into play because I believe the price relative to most things will largely be driven by how easily the supply can be manipulated. We compared real estate to ground beef and towards agricultural land. I believe that the price of ground beef will outperform real estate because agricultural land, the supply is harder to manipulate than the supply of real estate. With real estate, you can build up, you can also compress the size of housing units. With agricultural land, you can only build out. The supply of agricultural land is simply harder to manipulate than the supply of real estate. And that is a large reason why I believe ground beef will outperform real estate. If we look at Bitcoin, on the other hand, Bitcoin supply is the hardest to manipulate. You can manipulate the supply of everything else. You cannot manipulate the supply of Bitcoin. Therefore, I believe the price of everything will be going down relative towards Bitcoin over time. So if you own Bitcoin, I believe Bitcoin's going to outperform ground beef, and you will actually be able to afford ground beef in the future. You may not be able to afford ground beef in the future if you invest in something like real estate, but with Bitcoin, you may be able to do so. So yes, I am bullish on ground beef and other beef-related products, including beef jerky. However, I believe the best way to outperform these rising costs is to own the hardest money there is, whose supply cannot be manipulated, and that is by owning Bitcoin. So if you want to be able to afford these rising costs of goods, I believe the best way to do so is by owning Bitcoin, and then you will be able to afford your future. My name is Zane Gillespie. If you like this video, if you like the videos I've put out, please consider liking and subscribing to support my work and to support the channel.